This is the one of our weekly library data bites workshops, and my name is Kay Bjorkman, and I am the Research Data Initiatives librarian here at OSU. And so I and colleagues and various invited speakers provide these workshops on various data topics throughout the academic year. And so this is kind of a continuation of one that I offer on data management. Some of the topics that I will skid over a little bit on this particular workshop, I go into more depth in the data management workshop. And I always like to throw out a PhD comment because we can all relate, right? But here's what we'll talk about. I'm going to start by trying to convince you all that the best thing to do when we are creating a data management plan is to think of it in the big picture. Okay, that's the place to start. Many people, when they think about DMPs, they assume that it's a 2-page document thrown together when you submit a grant proposal. And you can do yourself and your research a huge favor by thinking of it well in advance of that. So I want you to think of it as a process. And so we're going to talk about data management planning as far as workflows and protocols and as a tool for open science. And then we'll kind of finish out with what the actual document should look like. And so, one question is, if it weren't for research funders, would any of us bother with a data management plan? And I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly would like to convince you that it's a very good idea, because all the planning that goes into it, all the thinking about things in advance is going to help with better research processes. And that's going to greatly increase your chances for research success. Most of us who have done research have had experiences where you suddenly realize at some, place down the path that, wow, I hadn't even thought of this. This is not, this is not what I wanted to do. And gee, what am I going to do now? And so you will never get entirely past that. But the more of this planning process you do, the less that, we can hopefully minimize it. Funders expect it. And so we'll talk about that in some more detail about why. But, for most people, that's the main driver, is that if I want to get funding for my project, I'm going to have to create this data management plan. It does support open science. And another kind of selfish reason to do it is that making your data accessible and open increases the citations, not just for the data, but also for your publications. There is studies that have shown that. If you are leading a lab, once you are a PI, you will care about things like onboarding and training students and postdocs and growing your lab. And so if you have planned, if you have created these policies and thought it through and have the documentation in place, it's going to make it much, much easier to bring these people on and have them doing good work. So, and then of course, submitting your proposals, it's going to be more painless, and they're going to be better and more likely to be funded if they have good data management plans in place. So the things that DMPs do, I think I've already covered a lot of these, but data integrity, preventing data loss, promoting your work, those are all the things it does. Here's what it doesn't do. Contrary to what many people think or concerned about, it does not require that you share all your data with anyone who requests it. And so that is something that I work with people to plan for is, who can have access to your data for what use, what purposes, and how to make that as easy as possible. DMPs do not update themselves, and you'll hear me be a little bit repetitive about that as we talk through this, but they are living documents. You create them at the start of a project when you are doing the best job you can to plan, but also some of it's guesswork. Some of it is you think you're going to be doing XYZ until you get into XYZ, and then you find out it's not working. It's not working the way you thought it should. And so you have to go back and rethink. And so when you do that, it's very important to go back and do the DMP to reflect what you're actually doing. So huge mistake that many people make is they write it up front and then they don't think about it again until they're ready to do an annual report or close out a grant. And so very important to regard that as that living document and keep it up to date. They also do not work best when they are thrown together 30 minutes before the grant proposal deadline. And you'll see on most of my slides, I have citations down here for where a lot of the information comes from. So please, when you are ready to jump into a grant proposal or writing a DMP, I encourage you to look up some of these for yourself and read in more detail. Okay, DMPs are in place to help you plan for open science. And open science is a term that we use a lot. And it's kind of the way science is going. It's the result of what's known as the reproducibility crisis, or the failure to be able to, even in some cases, even replicate your own research, but in most cases, being able to reproduce published research. I even remember from my own days, pulling up a paper that I thought would help me with a method. And when I went to try and recreate the method, and there was not sufficient detail provided, and it was worthless. So again, the intent is that all of these things are to help advance science by making it reproducible and creating enough documentation that other people can use it. Funders are interested in making the data that they pay for available to others who need to use it for a variety of reasons. And usually it's other scientists who are trying to do work in that same area, or sometimes it's, because they want to apply your work to even new areas. So by making, the data available, the methods available, it promotes wider sharing of both the data and the code. All of this is, I just spotted a typo in my slide. How annoying is that? Anyway, the FAIR principles, and FAIR principles are guidelines for researchers who are interested in making their data more available, and it provides a roadmap. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we are not going to go into this in detail. I encourage you to read up some of the resources that are out there for FAIR principles. But in essence, findable means you've provided enough description that it can be, and it's put in a public place or publicly accessible place so that it can be searched. Accessible means it's got a persistent identifier that makes it available, and hopefully for free, not behind a paywall. Interoperable means that there's enough of the metadata or controlled vocabulary available so that you can do the mapping, especially if you are trying to use data from one discipline in another discipline. Very often terms are not interchangeable. It's important to be sure they're clear so that people can figure out what applies in their field. And then reusable, just again, having adequate description, adequate metadata, so that the data can be reused. All right, so I'm going to start with this one, because even though probably, especially in STEM fields, most of the time we are doing data management planning, it's for government grants and government funding, but it's not just federal or government funds that require it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has this policy, which clearly states that they expect that any data or information that's created that they have funded should be available. And they even go so far as to express that they expect it to be published in open access journals and will help pay for it so that that's possible. But one of the major things that I want to talk about today is that anybody who expects to apply for or use NIH funding needs to be aware that there is a new data management and sharing policy that will be going into effect January 25th of 2023, which apparently coincides with the first of the deadlines for the NIH grant cycle. And although the policy itself, it doesn't express too many dramatically different things from what I've seen, say, for NSF and so on. Directionally, the data sharing is similar. And actually, NIH has really been at the forefront in many cases of promoting this. But there are a few things that is different. They will expect submission of data management and sharing plan for how your data will be managed and shared. And in the past, this only applied to large grants over 500,000. This now will apply to grants of any size. So a data management plan must be submitted even with small proposals. And another important thing to note is there are no permanent embargoes allowed. So they, again, great deal of emphasis on making sure that you have planned for sharing and making your data available. And the compliance with the approved plan, going back to that remember to update thing, it's expected that it will be followed. So if you write up this plan and then ignore it for until you're ready to submit your report, you're probably going to be in for a rude shock. Another thing to note about this, they do expect you to share even unpublished data. So even if if it's data that was generated under that grant, you will still need to make the data available, even if it's data that you wound up not publishing. Okay. All right, so just some information. Elements of an NIH data management and sharing plan are listed here. These are the 6 things that are expressly should be included in your plan. It's not very different from like NSF, but when you write a data management plan, it's a very good idea to go to the funder guidelines and look at them and be sure that it's stated in such a way that reviewers don't have to hunt for it. They don't have to So break it out into sections, or, make sure it's very clearly stated that you covered these things. Okay, so another couple of things I want to draw your attention to is the allowable costs for data management and sharing. So another thing that is in this new policy is, first of all, it says that you can include line items in the budget to cover any costs that are associated with doing the data management. So data curation, developing supporting documentation. So this may just be a matter of providing additional funding for graduate students beyond, just the experimental stage. Remember to include funding for the back end, a semester's worth of just doing the documentation, okay? Or it's also possible that if you are submitting it to a repository that provides those services, you may want to, to look into that and find out, will they provide that service and does it cost, okay? Local data management considerations. So, is there something during the course of the project that you need to be able to pay for storage or something of the sort? And then preserving and sharing through established repositories. One critical thing to note here is that if you need funding for the entire cost, for the entire length of the storage period, so if you expect this data to be useful for 10 years, as they state there, and you want to save it to a repository and there are fees associated for that entire 10 years, you need to request that funding upfront. It has to be paid before the grant period is finished. Okay, so another thing that it shows is some information about identifying a repository. NIH has significant guidelines for locating an appropriate repository, usually a disciplinary repository, and they've got lists of appropriate disciplinary repositories. But I want to draw your attention to actually, let's look at this one first, because it's shown basically in a hierarchy. So selecting a data repository, basically they want you to use a disciplinary, an appropriate disciplinary data repository if there's one available for your work. However, if there is not one, then, and they do have here under B, there's some other considerations. If you have just, frankly, a small data set, it's okay to submit that through the publisher as supplementary material. That is something I actually don't would urge you to do as a last resort, because there's also been studies that show a lot of those links are broken when you go looking at supplementary materials and publications. Data repositories, including generalist repositories or institutional repositories. So in our case, an institutional repository is ShareOK. So that's probably, again, that's not appropriate for large data sets. But if you have a small data set, you may want to look at that. It's certainly kind of a low barrier for entry. And then you may also need to look, if you do have large data sets, looking at cloud-based repositories. Okay, so now let's look at the generalist repository information here. And so this is a list of generalist repositories. If you're not familiar with that, a generalist repository is just a kind of an open door repository that will accept most any kind of data from most any kind of discipline. And there's varying amounts of structure in terms of types of data, types of metadata, and so on that they'll accept. So of these, Dataverse, Dryad are pretty well known. Figshare is very, again, probably the easiest entry barrier to use. Some of these others, but another one that I really want to draw your attention to is Open Science Framework. We teach workshops on using Open Science Framework here at OSU through the DataBytes, and the library actually pays I don't know if it's called a membership fee, but anyway, we pay some to make OSU an institutional member of Open Science Framework. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So all of those are acceptable for NIH-supported research. And so, at the time that you are considering the long-term process, because that's the last step, is what am I going to do with my data for long-term preservation? That is something you'll want to look at and include in your DMP. Okay, so DMP as a process. Again, I'm encouraging you to think about this at the very beginning of your research, when you're just getting things off the ground. Should capture data information at every step of the research data lifecycle. So, this rather confusing little diagram here on the right is taken from this Michener publication here. And I think what it's really trying to express is on top here, we have, the research life cycle where you generate the ideas, the research questions and hypotheses, acquire your data, analyze your data, publish, start over. Okay, very simple, right? Okay, B is actually expressing the steps for research data. And so, you at the beginning of your project sit down and plan for, or you go out and you look to see, is there existing data that you'll need to maybe cite or, potentially reuse, meta-analysis, or, collect and organize new data. And then notice all the dotted lines. Basically, all this is all of the, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back involved in collecting, managing, and organizing your data. So that's where the DMP comes in. Begin by developing DMPs for every facet of the project. Okay, so I would encourage you to consider starting with the lab or project level. These are the processes that are used over and over. It may be as simple as, do you require special cleaning or sterilization processes for glassware or for lab equipment? That kind of thing is going to be continued throughout every project through that lab, every project, every step in that process. So that would be the kind of thing that you would create that plan at the very start. And then you're going to work through, successive levels of detail. And you're going to want to create a folder system that's accessible to everyone. So if all your collaborators or the students or whoever is working in your lab is going to be doing these things, they also need to have access to the information. So finally, notice encourage a culture where documentation is updated regularly. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. All right. Before I go any further, I'm going to stop for just a second and ask if anyone has any questions about anything I've done so far. And while you're thinking about that for just a second, I am dropping the link to the slides back in the chat because I think we had one person join us a little bit late. So you can download the slides from this link. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so we'll press on. Okay, so we mentioned Open Science Framework. Open Science Framework is a platform which is really intended to be used for project management. And it is, as the name implies, it is really intended to be a tool for creating open science, making data, making projects publicly accessible. So if you look at this screenshot here, you can see up here in the upper right-hand corner that this project is public, but you have the option, it's by default, it is private. So when you create it, it's actually private. You have to make it public. That control is actually available at the component level. So here you see there's components for the data management plan, for literature, protocols, and so on. And every one of these components, you can set the permissions. You can make it either public or private. So this particular template was actually templated from something that Johns Hopkins University made available. It's intended to be used kind of as an electronic lab notebook. It is pretty complex. It's got multiple layers and levels. Whoop, wrong direction. This is a simpler template, and this one I found out about actually quite recently. It is actually built for economics type projects. And in addition to having a flatter structure, fewer folders and so on, but it also includes README files in each one of the folders that describes what it is that is supposed to go in those folders. So in each of these cases, if you go up here, and let's go ahead and open this one and take a look. Okay, so yeah, this is our template. And you see up here that we have the option to fork the project or to duplicate the template. And if you fork the project, you can then create your own modifications that are independent of the parent. And few features of this, if you're not familiar with OSF, you see that the contributors' names are up here, as well as information about when it was created. It has a DOI. It has a preface or a link to it. And it's got some descriptive information. This one is public. And the other thing that's interesting here, I'll draw your attention to, is it has formatted citations. So whenever you create a project or a component, it allows you to essentially make it very easily citable, which is quite useful. So here you see that it's just got a single folder called project. But if we open that, you see it's got several things under there. And so the first thing is to look at the text file, the README file. And this one's not very informative. It just says what should be in here is a README file and a report. I also should have noted you can download it from, there was a button up there in the upper right. And then there's, data, output, and scripts. And each one of these has, the different levels. So analysis, processing scripts, and so on are all included in this template. The other thing to draw your attention to, it is versioned. So every activity, every time a change is made, it is logged over here under recent activity, and it shows who did it, and what the change is, date, time stamped, and so on. Okay. Now, one of the benefits to this is that if you are creating a project in OSF and using it for a data management plan, again, it's acceptable to NIH. It also makes it so that you can plan ahead for creating those different levels of folders. If you need to, for instance, de-identify data before you publish it, or create a subset of your data for publishing that needs to be public, it's very simple to create a separate folder or a separate component for that. Okay, so this is it's a very good tool that allows you to plan for that data sharing. I'll mention this quickly. It is also possible certainly if you have a large project that you expect to go on for an extended period of time, and you wish to develop the necessary skills, there are such things as machine actionable DMPs, and more information down here below. They are pretty much what they say they are. It's a way of automating that process of maintaining and updating, okay? So it should be integrated into the workflows, just as we were talking about all those levels of planning. If you plan ahead for it, you can try and work to automate them. Obviously, automation has some huge benefits. It's, does not require anyone to remember anything. Once you get it established, it takes care of itself. It also minimizes transcription errors and things like that. Create policies for machines. So if you're collecting data from instrumentation or from, computers or whatever, you can create the workflows and the policies for those. Let's see, other things. Yeah, using the persistent identifiers and controlled vocabularies. We talked about that a bit, and so on. And it just makes DMPs very easily updatable, and it also makes it possible to make them readily publicly available. So again, more information from that reference. That's not a lot of detail on that one. All right, let's talk about a DMP as a document, okay? And much of this information is excerpted from Michener again. And when you start, so when we talk about a document, we're pretty much talking about it as that usually two-page submission that goes with a grant proposal, okay? The very first step should be consult the program officer. Hopefully you've already done that before you're starting your grant submission. Never too late. So if you're at the end and you're putting together that DMP, now's a good time. We have online tools such as DMP tool. There's another one shown here that is actually a UK tool. So I'll just mention it. I think generally we resort to DMP tool. And I will also mention that, even if you are applying for funding someplace, you've applied before, maybe even been successful and gotten funding in the past, it is a very good idea, and this kind of goes back to consulting program officer, to find out about any changes or updates. The trend is definitely towards the funding agencies including the DMPs as part of the grant proposal review. Okay, so that's why it's good to know if there are certain things they might be looking for, emphasizing. That's the kind of thing you can learn from the program officer. Okay, let's look at DMP tool here. I'm going to have so many windows open here. It's not even going to be funny, but okay. So this when you log in, I logged in through my institutional login. And so now it shows me my various ones that I've established when I've taught workshops. It also shows me too that OSU researchers have done and made public. So we're going to look at one of those here in just a minute. But before I do that, let me just show you, let's see which one of these. Yeah, let's look at this one. Okay, so first of all, you can see, if you're someone who, is writing a lot of grant proposals and has created a lot of DMPs, you have this dashboard and you can see, when were they created, who the owner is. If you have a collaborator who's written some and included you as a co-PI, that will show up here. And, visibility is, is it public, is it shared, and so on. And you can see here's the possible actions. Whoops. Yeah, so you can set your plan visibility, register your plan, and add to ORCID. So there's a lot of options that you can use with DMP tool that if you're just creating it in a Word document, you don't have those options. So, okay, let's see which one of these. Yeah, let's look at this one. So this one is one that I set up because I was working with somebody who was preparing a USDA NIFA grant proposal. And so let me just show you a few things about this. You can see project title. It does tell you at some point here, there's a reminder that whatever the title is needs to correspond exactly to what you submit with your proposal. Here's your abstract, domain, project start and end. And then if you have already, you should have already gone through your IRB. And if it does have any kind of, ethical concerns, you would check that. But here's where we chose our funder. And then here's where it tells you, right now we're planning it, but let's say it gets funded, you would put it in here, and then you'd remember to update accordingly, opportunity number and the grant number URL. Okay, another thing that you are able to do is select guidance. And the reason for this is, so here you can, DMP tool is just the standard hints and tricks. But so USDA NIFA, some of my collaborators are at Iowa State, and so I'm going to include their hints and tricks because I know they've had some success, and so they might know enough that I might want to pay attention to it. Okay. All right, go up here, select this collaborators. And this is where I would add any co-PIs that I wanted to contribute. And here's where we write the plan. So, this is the template that is provided by USDA. So expected data type, okay? And here's where those hints and tricks come in. So this is what USDA and DMP tool provide. Okay, give a summary, consider how it could complement or integrate with existing data, et cetera, et cetera. But here's what Iowa State provides, okay? They provide some additional information about metadata schemas, metadata, and so on. So, and I think if I recall correctly, Michigan Tech has a fairly long, and theirs actually has some institutional stuff about, go to this LibGuide and it'll provide you some additional information about version control, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's what that is. Then let's scroll through a couple more of these. Let's look at data storage and preservation. And so, this, you're just going to fill in each one of these text boxes with what you plan to do. Data sharing and public access, okay? And so on, roles and responsibilities. and monitoring and reporting. Okay, then once you finish with that, okay, a few more research outputs. What do you expect in the way of research outputs? And then download. You're able to download it. You can download it as a PDF, CSV, text file, Word doc, etc. Format it however you like and download it, and then finalize and publish. Okay. Before I move off of that, anybody have any questions on that? Like I said, I encourage you to play around with that. It is a very useful tool.
Yes, I have a quick question.
Okay.
Is it pretty typical for funding agencies to set like page limits on DMPs?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, yeah, pretty typically you get a 2-page limit. And so we'll look at how you can manage that. I have a couple of examples here. Yes, here's one. Okay, so this is available for download at here. This is one I actually wrote for a project that was not funded. But I used this as I used the guidance from the NSF, and here I'm dropping the link in the chat here. Okay. So again, that is downloadable. I've removed the guilty parties names so you can take a look. But whoop, I always forget that's not a document. Okay, so what you find is that, it's pretty closely typed. I have it broken out into sections, but definitely painfully aware of the space limitation. So you cram in as much information as you can, and you'll be pleasantly surprised that you can get in as much as you can. I'll show you an example of that when we get a little further towards the end of the workshop. And so just in general, here's, and I have this broken out according to the NIH sections. So data type, what do you expect to collect in the way of types of data? So, any of these and probably other things that I haven't even thought of. What are the sources? How are you going to collect it? How much of it? What are the formats? Keep in mind that the best thing is to collect non-proprietary where you can. So something like CSV files. What tools, software, and/or code? So how are you going to organize your data? Are you going to use spreadsheets, databases, R, for instance? And if you think about that, remember to look at, if you're stuck with using some sort of proprietary software, is there a cost associated? Versioning software, and then persistent identifiers. Okay, standards and documentation. Now we're getting a little bit into the weeds. Depending on your discipline, this, is something that may be very well documented and structured and not hard to find, or it may be something that you absolutely don't have a clue about. And so, for instance, disciplines such as genomics, neuroscience, that kind of thing have a very, very extensive published documentation around controlled vocabularies, metadata schema, et cetera, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. You can probably find it through, your professional organizations or hopefully your PI or colleagues, whatever. But that's not universally true. So when you are looking at this, what you're trying to think of is, how do I need to describe this so that other people can understand it? already talked about this a little bit, but using a README text file, that's important. Data level, you can embed it in data files, and we'll show you an example of that, which will look very familiar to Evan. Determine whether disciplinary or community standard metadata schema is available. I've already mentioned that. It's basically, that's critical for that interoperability that we described earlier on. And I will mention this because the Data Curation Center, again, it's a UK organization, but they have a very handy tool here for searching for metadata schema and controlled vocabularies and so on. So if you're in biology, I noticed it looks like at least two of you are. You can go in here and look through this list and try and determine, what's appropriate. What do you need for what you're doing? Okay, so that's a useful resource. And remember that your metadata, the point of it is to make it so that your data is machine readable. And another thing to consider is it is possible that, again, depending on your discipline, you may be able to automate some of your metadata creation. So MetaVist and Morpho, I think, are both ecology tools, but depending again on the size of the data you're collecting and the method of collecting it, you may want to investigate that. So this is an example of a project here at OSU, and this was one that, again, Evan helped me locate. And the screenshot here is, the mapping, soil moisture mapping project. Here's our reference, and the appropriate metadata schema were identified from ESIP and NetCDF. And I'll just show you real quickly one of these. Okay, so, where it talks about crosswalks, metadata, link attributes, and so on. This is where it gets into the weeds about identifying, how your metadata should be set up. Okay, so that's a resource. And then I mentioned that, if you're accumulating very large quantities of data, that you may wish to take advantage of tools for creating and automating metadata. And in this case, it's, I believe, NetCDF, that's creating the file headers and generating metadata as part of the process, as part of the data collection. And there's links here that take you to examples. Anything you want to add to that, Evan?
Nothing comes to mind immediately.
Okay, all right. Well, feel free to provide to the benefit of your wisdom. Okay, data preservation and quality. And so another thing to include in your DMP is how are you going to make sure that your data quality is good? What quality assurance steps are you going to include? Some of the things I personally encourage, because it's really not that hard to do for most types of data collection, create and use a template, okay? This can be something, it can be a web form, it can be a spreadsheet, it can be something, but by doing that, you create consistency, and when you collect the data, even if it's in a lab notebook, if you have a template from a spreadsheet, taped to the front of your lab notebook, and you consult it, you're not going to forget something. And it's so easy to do when you're manually collecting data. Some other suggestions: plan for checking completeness, doing random sample checks. Who's going to do that? We'll talk about roles and responsibilities, but again, this should all be part of the process. Sometimes you may want some redundancy. using software to check for outliers or entry errors. OpenRefine and Excel are really good tools for that. And create rules for how to handle and document errors. This is really important. Again, part of the lab level or certainly project level documentation should be, here's what happens if I discover that there's been an error, 3 steps back in the process, okay? Here's how I document it. Here's how I treat the files that I realize are corrupted or not going to be beneficial. Okay, timelines, thinking about how long you're going to need it. How long will you need the data during, what data do you need access to during the project? And then more importantly, think about the long term. As you're generating this data, it's useful to think about it in terms of, are there limitations on why this data might not be valuable after, say, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Depends entirely on, some of this is going to be dictated by, again, funder requirements, publishing dates, that kind of thing. But it should be part of the planning process for your project. Plan to share it as soon as possible. Again, NIH says no indefinite embargoes. Generally, embargoing is something that is frowned upon. They want you to, as soon as you are ready to publish, that data should be ready to share. There are exceptions to this, of course, but this is the mindset. All right, storage options during a project. Got a bunch listed here. Think about where it's going to be stored during the project. What's the capacity? Consider backup planning. And then think about the long-term storage. And we've mentioned the general data repositories, already mentioned some of this, and investigate, share, okay. And if you really don't know where to start, if NIH is not who your funder is and you really don't know where to start, locating a repository, this re3data.org is a registration of repositories. And so you could go in there and search according to discipline and according to your needs and find a repository. Okay, a few other considerations: licensing and data use agreements for data reuse. So if you want to make your data and can make your data fully available, the licensing is a way of saying, okay, I'm okay with people using this for non-commercial purposes, as long as they give me attribution, or I'm okay with them using it for any purpose. I never want to see this data again. And so whatever anybody wants to do with it is fine with me. Sharing arrangements for pre-existing materials, embargo, etc. You may need to address export control regulations and IP. So, and this is another thing I have not gone into that really needs to be at the front of your planning as far as, is this something that there is potential intellectual property involved? That is a whole nother branch on that planning process. And then of course the IRB and handling sensitive data, that should have been taken care of by now as well. So, okay, availability. I think to a large extent I've already described this. Basically, think about it in terms of the greatest extent of sharing you can do with the fewest restrictions. One thing you'll want to consult is if you know where you plan to publish, you'll want to look at the journal guidelines for publication and for data sharing. Some of them have data policies, some of them don't. It just depends. And let's see. Okay, and citation. This is some of the information that a good repository should provide you. All right, and then we talked about roles and responsibilities. Again, who's going to do this stuff? Think about it, include that spelled out in your DMP. Who is responsible for making sure that the QA checks are done, who's responsible for catching things before it gets to the publication, who's responsible for oversight of technicians, students, whatever. All that needs to be spelled out. And for a really large project, it's possible that data may require someone dedicated to that and that alone. And if that's the case, it should be, again, mentioned in the DMP. It should also be included in the funding. And another typo. Oh, okay. Budget, we've already talked about this. These are all things that can be included in the budget document. And then I did want to show you this. It is a DMP for a large multidisciplinary NSF EPSCoR funded project. Okay, and yeah, you'll have to see the slides to read this. The print's too small. I think one of the points to this is, again, your comment, Danny, about the page limit. If you read this, you'll see how much you can cram into 2 pages. It also is an interesting example for the simple reason that because it's an EPSCoR, and for that matter, the one I shared that was the NSF also was education related. And so it's one thing if you have a nice, fairly carefully defined project that you can, see the edges, the margins, and say, okay. But some of these projects are really diffuse, and trying to figure out things like, well, what kind of data are students going to generate if we get this STEM funding project can be really challenging. And so this is, an example of how some of that kind of challenge is dealt with. These are some of the resources. I think a lot of them are on the slides. And yeah, remember that life's greatest lessons are usually learned at the worst times and from the worst mistakes. And all of my workshops are presented in the hopes that I will be able to prevent at least 1 or 2 people from making some of the worst mistakes. So with that, this is my information, how you can reach me. Please feel free to do so if you have any questions of any kind. I am available to consult and help with creating DMPs and answering any other data-related questions.